Early access games are quite the double-edged blade. On one hand, developers get regular feedback by players at an early stage of their game, but on the other hand, developers may be less incentivized to develop their game at a natural pace for release. With the accessibility of early access titles across Steam and even some home console games, the frequency of games never reaching completion has grown dramatically over the years. If a game is already earning a developer money through its alpha and beta stages, why continue all of that hard work just to call it a different version number? However, the developers who truly value their work and their players will stick it out to the end. Delver is a first-person roguelike adventure game developed by Priority Interrupt that speaks volumes to the vast improvements a game can undergo throughout its development process. With randomized dungeons, weapons, items, enemies, and enchantments, every player has to pay very close attention to each move they make as they wander through dungeons that truly emphasize the feeling of being an adventurer. So, let's plunder the details of this indie game as we uncover what's so great about Delver. Delver was created in 48 hours. At least that's how it started. In August of 2011, Chad Cuddigan developed the engine for Delver in under 48 hours, having been inspired by a recent stream by Marcus Notch Persson, the creator of Minecraft, who had been developing an entry for the Ludum Dare game jam. Cuddigan created his own 48-hour project and began posting it to the TIG forums as an alpha build in March of 2012. Cuddigan regularly updated the forums with his new ideas and screenshots, taking comments and suggestions from other members of the forum. After almost 5 years of development, Delver was released fully in February of 2018 as the first full game to be released by Cuddigan, his other projects being a 7-day FPS clone of Delver titled Boarding Party and a 2014 Flappy Jam in-browser entry titled Gargoyle Flap. Part of the charm of Delver is definitely due to the team's virtually transparent development process. It may have been trapped in a bit of an early access limbo for over 4 years, but step by step, the small team of Priority Interrupt would always include their player base on everything going on behind the scenes. This was a great way to get feedback, but also keep their fans excited about upcoming additions to the game. In fact, lead artist Joshua Skelton regularly streamed his behind-the-scenes work on updates and developments for 72 consecutive weeks, and 116 streams total. He even took viewer suggestions on improvements or just opinions as development progressed further. These open lines of communication constructed a game that the developers knew people were enjoying, so they didn't have to cross their fingers and hope at release. In Delver, you take on the position of an unnamed explorer, simply referred to as Delver. After an interesting dream state at the beginning of the game, you find yourself in a camp of merchants and adventurers who talk about the dangers of the dungeons ahead, specifically a dungeon out of which nobody has returned. As you enter the dungeon and plunder through each floor, you will come across randomly scattered notes left behind by previous squads of adventurers, archaeologists, and other curious individuals. These notes not only reveal a bit more about the truths behind this dungeon, but they may even drop hints about the enemies and traps that you may come across in any given area. At the start of the game, the player is in the exact same position of the main character. You are dropped into your first dungeon with little to no explanation of where you are. The dungeon is a complete mystery and is equal parts interesting and overwhelming. In fact, every dungeon is, as they're all randomly generated with every death. This feeling of uncertainty on this new adventure you've been thrust into is a perfect way to connect you to a character that you would otherwise have no connection to. It's time to piece everything together on your own adventure, not just fulfilling the wishes of some character's story that you're suddenly supposed to care about right away. And it's a good thing you don't have to be too attached to this character, because the game is permadeath. Every death is tallied on your save file as a bit of a mocking incentive to do better with every attempt. The only thing you keep between lives is whatever money you've accumulated between every attempt at the dungeon, while your items will return to a random assortment of beginner's equipment with every spawn. Some permanent changes to your inventory can also be purchased for a pretty penny, and only on one specific floor of the dungeon, so you gotta survive until there first. The attention to each possible room of a dungeon is what tugs at your desire to see what's around every single corner. Maybe there's something hidden in those dark corners. It's very obvious from the placement of the torches and candles throughout the game that there was a large focus on lighting every room in a unique way that challenges a player's curiosity. No room is poorly lit, but rather all of them are very practically lit. The inability to place your own light sources keep this sense throughout the dungeon. This isn't like Minecraft where you can slam torches onto every conceivable surface and suddenly your cave is as bright as day. The constant gloominess around every turn maintains the sense of discovery from the moment you enter a dungeon and with every room you pass, even if you've been through that certain area before. In fact, approaching the same room from a different direction often displays that section of the dungeon in a new way, allowing for multiple discoveries or at least consistent, interesting points of view. During development, Joshua Skelton would go through each possible generation of dungeon rooms and rate how interesting each section was on a scale from 1 to 5, then work on improving the rooms to make everything as interesting as possible. The way the dungeons fit together stylistically is actually a big testament to leaving the adventure up to the player. Many games present huge, bright rooms with a few puzzles in order to make a player think they are accomplishing something with every room, even if it's just pushing a block onto a button or finding a switch on a wall somewhere. In Delver, checking around each corner becomes much more interesting because you aren't forced to solve a contrived puzzle just to continue exploring. Traps ramp up the interesting mechanics in terms of not only caution, but exploration and strategy as well. When coming across a new trap, for instance a pressure plate on the floor, you can throw junk items onto it to see what happens. This strategy allows for safer traversing of hallways that might otherwise doom your current campaign. But if you discover the pads are used for teleporting, you can use this to your advantage to quickly hop around the dungeon in search of an exit or additional loot, or maybe to just get rid of enemies that are following you, whom you can also lure into deadly traps as an extra means of defense. Using the environment to the best of your ability greatly smooths out any chaotic run-through. Every dangerous situation has to be weighed against the reward. Is it really worth it? Maybe there's some other way around? Sure, it'll take longer, but what matters more, time or health? And it's easy to become a little overconfident as your skills increase throughout the game. You're still going to have to keep an eye on your surroundings and situations. As traps become more frequent as well as harder to detect, you can't go blundering through each floor, regardless of your shiny equipment that you've now amassed. The enemies may seem simple, but the AI is actually very smooth. There are different classes of enemies for every floor, with heavy hitters, ranged attackers, or even enemies who will hit you with a life-ruining debuff. The creatures of the dungeon even run from you when injured, but will still defend themselves if backed into a corner. Additionally, some enemies only spawn out of certain rooms or even out of certain breakable items, keeping you on your toes at all times. Randomly generated weapons and items with even further randomizations of attributes allow for incredibly diverse runs every time you open the game. You're up to the mercy of the dungeon as well as your own management abilities. All of these combinations of enemies, items, and dungeon layouts create great versatility for an ever-changing spelunking experience. Delver is truly an adventure. Every discovery has to be made at your own pace and for your own reasons. There is no main character narrative to fill in the blanks, just the dungeons you explore, the paths you choose, and the successes and failures you accumulate along the way. The design of the game perfectly frames the disparity between known and unknown as you fight shadows and monsters with wits and experience. Every room is shaped to take advantage of what you aren't prepared for, while the mechanics allow you to utilize everything you've learned and collected along the way to combat the steadily increasing difficulty right to the very end. Delver is one of those games where you really can't tell what will happen next in terms of updates. I mean, I picked up this game over 4 years ago on a whim during a Steam summer sale, played it for half an hour, and then, as with most cheap Steam games, didn't touch it for years. I randomly reopened it a few weeks ago, and it felt like an entirely different game in all of the best ways possible. Starting from a tiny 48-hour game jam project, this fantasy roguelite grew exponentially with every long-awaited update. And while this game certainly deserves more attention than it has received so far, it continues to leave itself open for endless improvements, as well as a great lesson for the developers to move on to future projects. This fine-tuned little project is a fantastic testimony to the benefits of creating early access titles the right way, and that is what's so great about Delver. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming as we plunged through the quality of Delver. There's a lot of negativity out there when it comes to opinions on video games, and we want to focus on what makes every aspect of gaming so great. If you think the same way, consider subscribing to be a part of our community so you're always in on the discussions. If you have a favorite series or a single game that you think is great, leave a comment of your choice and we'll look into it. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.